The diner smelled like burnt coffee and old grease, the kind of smell that clings to everything in a town that stopped growing 30 years ago. Maeve had chosen the corner booth, the same one she always chose, not because she liked it, but because nobody could sit behind her there. At 58, she had developed the habit of keeping her back to the wall, not out of fear, out of exhaustion. Outside, the Wyoming sky was doing the thing it did in October, turning that particular shade of bruised amber that made the flatlands look like the edge of something ending. A semi rumbled past on Route 14 without slowing down. The neon sign above the diner door buzzed and flickered, and then the door opened, and a man walked in with two children, and something in the air of that room changed so quietly that only Maeve seemed to notice. Before this story goes any further, stop for a second, because what you are about to watch is not just a story about food. It is about what happens when a woman who has given up on herself accidentally stumbles into someone who still believes in everything she buried. Here is something to think about while you watch. Have you ever lied to protect someone you love, not to deceive them, but because the truth would cost them too much? Drop your answer in the comments below. Tell us what city you are watching from. And if a story like this one deserves to exist in the world, give it a like and subscribe, because more stories like this are on the way. Now, back to Wyoming. Back to that diner. Back to the man with the children and the lie he was about to tell. The town of Pardell, Wyoming sat at the junction of two state roads that most GPS systems simply ignored. Population, 900 and some change, depending on who had left that season and who hadn't gotten around to it yet. The surrounding land was the kind of beautiful that required patience, flat to the eye at first glance, then slowly revealing its ridges and creek beds and the occasional brutal grace of a cottonwood leaning into the wind. Maeve Colton had been born 40 miles north of here. She had driven south with her husband Daniel 32 years ago when he found a parcel of land with a creek running through it and announced, with the particular certainty of a man in love with a place, that they would build something here. They had, and it had been beautiful. The Colton Horse Sanctuary had operated for 19 years at the end of a gravel road that wound through two cattle gates and a row of old junipers that Daniel had planted himself. At its peak, the property had housed 14 horses, 3 part-time hands, and a program that brought veterans and children with developmental challenges out to work with animals trained specifically for therapeutic contact. The horses had names. They had routines. They had learned, through years of patient handling, to stand very still in the presence of a crying human. Daniel had understood something that most people only read about in magazines, that there was a kind of healing that did not come from words or medicine, but from the warm, enormous, breathing presence of another creature that asked nothing of you and judged nothing about you. He had built the sanctuary on that principle. Maeve had run it beside him, a full partner in every decision, every heartbreak, every early morning. Then, 18 months ago, Daniel had gone to the doctor about a cough that wouldn't quit. 6 weeks later, he was gone. The horses had been sold or transferred within 4 months. Not because Maeve had to. She had the land. She had some savings. But because she could not make herself walk out to those stalls in the morning. Could not make herself fill the water buckets. Could not look at the round pen where Daniel used to stand with his arms loose at his sides and wait for a frightened animal to decide it was safe to come close. The property sat now in a state of held breath. The fences needed repair. The barn roof had a section that sagged after a heavy snow the previous February. The pastures had grown back in wild grass, which was not unattractive, but which felt less like recovery and more like forgetting. Maeve had taken to eating dinner at Grover's Diner 3 nights a week. It was not a habit she had chosen so much as one she had fallen into. The way a person falls into any routine when the alternative is sitting alone in a kitchen that used to feed 2. Grover Hitch owned the diner and the 3 buildings behind it, including a storage shed and an old equipment barn that had been standing since the 50s. He was a compact man in his mid-60s, with the permanent squint of someone who spent too much time outdoors before deciding indoors was better. He ran a tight operation, clean counters, fixed prices, no tabs. He tolerated regulars the way a person tolerates weather, not warmly, but without active complaint. He and Maeve had an understanding that consisted mainly of him refilling her coffee without being asked and her leaving a tip that covered the inconvenience of the corner booth. It was a Tuesday in October when the man and the 2 children came through the door. Maeve watched them from the corner booth the way she watched most things these days, without expectation, without investment, the way you watch clouds move when you have nowhere to be. The man was somewhere in his late 30s, though he moved like he was older. Tall, with the particular leanness that comes not from fitness, but from a long period of not eating quite enough. He wore a denim jacket that had been washed too many times, and his boots, though clean, had been resoled at least once. He had dark eyes that moved quickly around the room before settling, and this was the detail that caught Maeve's attention on the children before anywhere else. He checked on them the way people check on valuable things in an unfamiliar place. The children were small. The girl, maybe 6, maybe 7, with 2 braids coming apart at the ends, climbed into the booth across from the man with the automatic ease of a child who had done this in many diners before. The boy was younger, possibly 4, and he sat pressed against the man's side the way small animals press against warmth. Maeve picked up her coffee. The waitress, a young woman named Daria who had been working at Grover's since high school and showed no signs of leaving, came over with menus. The man studied his for longer than the menu at Grover's warranted. Then he ordered 1 bowl of beef soup and 2 waters. 1 bowl, for 3 people. Daria didn't react. She wrote it down and left. Maeve set her coffee down. She did not stare. She had been raised in a part of the world where staring at a stranger's difficulty was considered a kind of violence, a way of making their circumstance more real by witnessing it with too much attention. So she looked at her food, and she listened. The bowl arrived. It was Grover's standard beef soup, a modest portion by any measure, a ladle of broth with chunks of potato and a few pieces of meat swimming in it, accompanied by 2 small rolls. Not much for 1 person, not nearly enough for 3. The man set it in the center of the table between the children. The little girl looked at it, then looked at her father. Something passed across her face that Maeve recognized as the expression of a child who understands more than she is supposed to. The boy reached for a roll immediately, and the man let him have it without hesitation. Maeve watched the man move the bowl closer to the children, watched him tear the second roll in half and give both halves to them, watched him sit back with his water glass and do the thing that he had clearly rehearsed, because he did it without dramatic pause or performance. He simply picked up the water glass and said, in a voice that carried just enough for Maeve to hear, that he'd already eaten back at the ranch, big lunch, wasn't even hungry. The girl looked up at him. He held her gaze and gave a single nod, the kind of nod that is not an answer to a question but an instruction. Accept this, don't push on it. The girl looked back at the soup. She picked up the spoon and gave it to her brother first. Maeve put her fork down. She looked at her own plate. A full meal, beef stew with biscuits, more food than she would probably finish. She had ordered it mostly out of habit, the way she did most things now. She sat with what she had just seen for approximately 90 seconds. Then she caught Daria's eye and made a small gesture. Daria came over. Maeve leaned in and spoke quietly. She asked for 3 full meals boxed to go. The stew, 2 orders of the chicken with mashed potatoes, and the 2 large pieces of the cornbread that she knew Grover kept under the counter because he thought nobody noticed them. She handed Daria a folded amount of cash that covered it all and told her to bring it out in a bag without explaining who it was for. The bag arrived before the children had finished the soup. Maeve took it to the register, paid her own bill, and left. She sat in her truck in the parking lot for a moment, the paper bag on the passenger seat, and looked at the diner window. She could see the booth. The children were still eating. The man was still watching them with that expression she had no name for, something between hunger and tenderness, and an exhaustion so deep it had passed through pain into something quieter. She had not intended to follow him. That had not been the plan. But when the man and the 2 children came out 20 minutes later and got into a pickup truck that had at least 1 taillight held in place with electrical tape, Maeve started her engine without quite deciding to. She kept 2 car lengths back. The truck turned south off Route 14 onto a county road that she knew went past 2 defunct farms and eventually ended at the old Hester equipment barn that Grover rented out to nobody in particular, because nobody particular had come along to rent it. Except, apparently, someone had. The truck turned into the Hester barn property. Maeve stopped at the road. She waited until the lights inside the barn went on, a warm, low glow through the boards, and then she drove quietly up to the edge of the yard, left the paper bag on the wooden step of the barn's side door, and left. She did not knock. She told herself it was out of respect. She went back the next morning because she had not slept. It was not guilt that kept her awake, or not only guilt. It was something less definable, a low-frequency unease, like the feeling you get when you've left a door open somewhere in the house and can't remember which one. She drove out before 7, when the frost was still on the grass and the sun was a white suggestion behind the eastern ridge. She parked at the road again. She was not planning to knock. She was going to look at the property from a distance and confirm that the bag was gone, which would confirm that they had found it and eaten, which would allow her to stop thinking about them. The bag was gone, but what stopped her from driving away was not the empty step. It was the horse. The barn's main doors were partially open, not the large front doors, but a side panel on the north wall that swung outward onto a small paddock area she hadn't noticed in the dark. And in that paddock, moving in a way that didn't quite belong to anything she had seen in 18 months, moving the way water moves, the way fire moves, with that particular quality of power that exists completely on its own terms, was a horse. He was black, or very nearly. In the early morning light, he had a blue undertone to his coat that made him look like something painted by someone who had never seen a horse but had dreamed about one. He was large, 16 hands at least, with a chest that spoke of breeding, thoroughbred blood in there, and something else, warm blood maybe, a deliberate crossing of traits. His mane was uncut and fell to one side. His tail had been matted at some point and was only partway through growing back. He was beautiful in the way that damaged things are sometimes beautiful, with an intensity that normal, uncomplicated things don't have. He was also circling the paddock with his neck low and his nostrils working and his eyes rolled to show a thin crescent of white. Every few passes he would stop and swing his head toward the barn door, and his whole body would go rigid for a moment, not ready to bolt, but ready for whatever came after bolting, which is a different and more dangerous state. Maeve got out of her truck. She did not approach. She stood at the fence line and watched him. He saw her. He stopped circling. For a long moment, they regarded each other across 20 feet of frost-covered ground. Then the man's voice came from inside the barn. Low, steady, the way you talk to something that needs to believe it is safe. She heard him say a name. Eclipse. He said it twice, and the second time the horse's ears came forward. The man appeared in the doorway. He saw Maeve. He went very still in the way people go still when they are calculating something. She raised a hand. Not a wave exactly, more a statement of presence without threat. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he came out, up close, in daylight. He looked worse than he had in the diner. The line of his jaw was too sharp. His hands, when he tucked them into his jacket pockets, were the hands of someone who had been working hard in cold weather for too long. He had a healing cut above his left eyebrow that he had not had treated properly. They stood on either side of the fence. She told him she had left the food last night. She said it plainly, without apology or expectation of gratitude, because she had not done it to be thanked. He absorbed this. His face didn't change much, but something behind his eyes did. A brief contraction, like a person pressing a bruise to confirm it's still there. He said thank you. Just those 2 words, and nothing else, which told her more than a longer speech would have. She asked about the horse. That was when the silence changed character. He looked back at Eclipse, who had resumed his slow, low-headed circuit of the paddock, and something moved through the man's expression that was not easy to name. Not pride exactly, not grief exactly, but something that lived in the territory between them. He said the horse had been through something, that he was working on it, that the horse wasn't dangerous, he just needed time. Maeve looked at Eclipse. He was not the first traumatized animal she had seen. She had spent 19 years working with animals that had been mishandled, mistreated, or simply overwhelmed by the world. She knew what trauma looked like in a horse, the way it lived in the shoulders, in the particular angle of the neck, in the speed at which the eye moved. Eclipse was traumatized, deeply, comprehensively traumatized in the way that takes months to reach and months more to come back from. But he was also responding to the man's voice. That, Maeve had learned a long time ago, meant something. She asked his name. The man said Wayland. She told him hers. They did not shake hands. She was about to leave. She had gotten what she came for. She had confirmed they were all right. She could go back to her empty house now, when she heard the sound of a vehicle on the county road. Both of them looked toward it at the same time. It was Grover's truck. Grover pulled in without hurry, which was worse than if he had come in fast. Fast would have meant urgency. Slow meant something had already been decided. He got out of the truck and looked at the scene. Maeve at the fence, Wayland in the paddock entrance, the horse moving nervously behind him, with the expression of a man checking an inventory and finding something missing. He nodded at Maeve first, a professional courtesy the kind you extend to someone whose presence you acknowledge but whose involvement you haven't quite authorized. Then he looked at Wayland. He said he was glad he had caught them both. Said it the way people say things they have rehearsed in the truck on the way over. Wayland didn't move. He stood with his hands still in his jacket pockets and waited. Grover said the arrangement with the barn had been informal and that he was sorry for the situation, but that informal arrangements couldn't go on indefinitely. He said Wayland owed 2 weeks of back rent on the space, which at the agreed rate came to $280. He said he understood times were hard. He said he needed to know by end of week whether Wayland intended to stay, and if he was staying, he needed to see the rent, and he needed the horse to be registered with the county as a boarding animal, because without proper registration, the animal was technically unlicensed livestock on private land, which created liability. He paused. Then he added, and here was the part that changed the weight of everything, that he had already had a call from someone on the regional livestock board asking about the property and about an unregistered animal. He let that sit. Eclipse, at the back of the paddock, had stopped moving. He was standing with his head low, watching Grover with a stillness that looked nothing like calm. Wayland said he understood. He said he would have the money by Friday. Grover looked at him the way a banker looks at a man who has said the same thing before. Not unkindly, but not without skepticism. Then Grover looked at Maeve. He didn't say anything for a moment. He was waiting for her to explain herself or to remove herself. Either one would have been acceptable to him. Maeve looked at the horse. Then she looked at Grover and asked him who had called the livestock board. Grover said he didn't know for certain. Said he'd heard it was someone from the Regional Breeders' Council up in Casper. Said they had an interest in an animal that had been reported missing from a property after an accident. An animal that matched the description of this horse, more or less. The word accident landed differently than Grover intended it to. Or maybe exactly as he intended it to. Wayland didn't move. His expression didn't change. But Maeve, who had spent 19 years watching what living creatures did with pain, saw his shoulders drop 1 millimeter. The involuntary contraction of someone absorbing a word that has been used against them before. She understood then that whatever the accident was, and whatever Wayland's relationship to it was, the word was not neutral. It had been used as a weapon at some point, probably recently, and it had left marks. Grover said he'd give Wayland until Friday. He got back in his truck. He drove back down the county road at the same unhurried pace he had arrived. The silence he left behind was the kind that has content in it. Maeve didn't leave. She stood at the fence and looked at the horse, who had come to stand at the far edge of the paddock, as far from the gate as the space allowed. After a long moment, she asked Wayland where the children were. Still asleep, he said. In the truck. They slept in the truck, which was warmer than the barn. She turned to look at the old pickup with the taped taillight. Through the rear window, she could see the silhouette of 2 small shapes under what appeared to be a sleeping bag and a moving blanket. She looked back at the horse. She looked at the barn, at the sagging fence line, at the water bucket that had a thin skim of ice on it that Wayland had broken and pushed to the side. She asked him how long he had been here. 3 weeks, he said, give or take. She asked how the horse had gotten hurt. He said it was complicated. She said she had time. He said he wasn't sure she'd want to hear it. She turned to look at him fully then, for the first time in the conversation, and she held his gaze until he looked away, not because she was aggressive, but because she had been married for 30 years to a man who also deflected pain with practicality, and she had learned that the best way to break through it was patience that had a spine to it. He looked back at her, and he started talking. The accident had happened 8 months ago at a ranch 60 miles east of here, owned by a man named Grant Aldis, who had run one of the more respected breeding operations in the state for 20 years. Wayland had worked there for 6 of those years, not as a ranch hand, but as a trainer, specifically as the person responsible for early handling of young horses and for the rehabilitation of animals that came in with behavioral problems. Grant Aldis had been a good man, not a perfect man, but good in the ways that mattered in that world. He kept his word, he paid on time, he treated his horses with a seriousness that bordered on reverence. He had taken Wayland on when Wayland was 29 and barely keeping it together after his wife's departure, and he had treated him with the combination of exacting standards and basic human decency that a person in that state needs more than anything. Eclipse had come to the ranch 2 years before the accident, a 5-year-old with extraordinary conformation, but a history at his previous farm of explosive behavior that had injured a groom and made him essentially unsellable. Grant had acquired him for a low price, seeing something in the animal that most people had given up on. He had assigned Eclipse to Wayland. The work had gone slowly. It always did with horses like Eclipse. But it had gone. Over 16 months. Wayland had brought him from an animal that would not let a human within 20 feet to one that could be handled, led, and ridden with consistency. Not perfectly. Not yet. But the trajectory was clear. Then, in February, Grant Aldis had made a decision. He had been approached about a breeding arrangement with a property in Colorado, a valuable arrangement, one that would have significant financial implications. The arrangement required moving Eclipse, whose bloodlines were the primary interest. Grant had decided to transport the horse before Wayland felt he was ready. They had disagreed about this. It had been one of the few genuine arguments in 6 years of working together. The transport had gone wrong. The exact details Wayland did not go into. What Maeve understood was this. Something had happened during the loading process. There had been a vehicle problem. Eclipse had been injured, and the groom who had been handling him had been seriously hurt. The groom had recovered. Eclipse had been left with both physical injuries and a psychological fracture that undid most of the work Wayland had done. Grant Aldis had been shaken by the accident, genuinely shaken, in the way of a man who had spent a career not letting things like this happen. He had been in poor health for the preceding year, something none of his employees had fully understood the severity of. 6 weeks after the accident, Grant Aldis had died. Not from the incident, from the illness that had already been advancing before any of this. His estate had been complicated. His adult children, who had not been involved in the ranch, had arrived and immediately begun the process of liquidating assets, including the horses. Including Eclipse. The livestock board, working with the estate's representatives, had determined that Eclipse was an unmanageable animal who had caused injury and posed ongoing liability. They had recommended euthanasia. Wayland had asked for 30 days to prove otherwise. He had been refused. He had taken the horse. He told Maeve this last part without embellishment. He said it simply. He had taken the horse, in the night, 2 days before the scheduled euthanasia. He had loaded Eclipse into his own trailer, the one he owned personally, not the ranch's. He had driven west with his 2 children in the front seat and an 8-year-old traumatized horse in the back. And he had ended up here, in a barn on the edge of a town that asked no questions, trying to figure out what came next. He stopped talking. Maeve stood with this for a moment. Then she asked him one question. She asked who they were blaming for the accident. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said they were blaming him. She asked if he had let them. The silence that followed was not the same as the earlier silence. It had a different texture, sharper, more specific, the kind that comes when a question has found the place it was looking for. He said Grant had a legacy, 2 kids, a reputation that had taken 20 years to build. He said the accident was the result of a decision Grant made in a moment of financial pressure, and that Grant had known it was the wrong decision when he made it, and had told Wayland as much 2 days before he died, and that it would serve nothing for that to be the last thing people knew about a man who had spent 20 years doing things right. So he had stayed quiet. Maeve looked at Eclipse, who had drifted closer during the conversation and was now standing at the fence line, not touching it, but near it, near Wayland's voice. She thought about Daniel, about the way a person's legacy was the story that survived them, about the cruelty and the mercy of that. She asked Wayland if he had a lawyer. He said he didn't have any money for a lawyer. She said she hadn't asked about money. She walked back to her truck, started it, and drove home. The Breeders' Council came 4 days later. There were 3 of them in 2 vehicles, a black SUV and a county animal control truck that had been requested, apparently, on a voluntary basis, which meant it had been requested by someone with influence. The council representatives were men in their 50s and 60s who wore the particular expression of people doing something they considered necessary and had rehearsed enough justifications for. Maeve was already at the barn when they arrived. She had been there since 6 in the morning. She had brought breakfast for the children and coffee for Wayland, and she had spent an hour watching Eclipse from outside the paddock, not approaching, not speaking, just being present in the way she had been taught, by decades of work, was often the first language a frightened animal needed to hear. Grover was with the council. He had not invited himself. He had been called, as the property owner, which was technically correct and practically convenient for everyone who wanted him there. The council spokesperson, a compact man named Harmon with a silver mustache and the practiced patience of someone accustomed to having the last word, presented a document. It was an official notice of inquiry from the Wyoming Livestock Board, citing the animal's unregistered status, its history of injurious behavior, and the ongoing investigation into its unauthorized removal from the Aldous estate. The document was not an order. It was a warning, which was more efficient than an order because it gave the recipient the opportunity to comply voluntarily, which made everything tidier. Harmon addressed Wayland. He said the situation could be resolved with minimal complications if Wayland surrendered the animal today, signed a statement confirming the circumstances of the removal, and cooperated with the inquiry. Wayland stood with his arms at his sides. Leo was behind him, partially hidden behind his father's leg, one hand gripping the hem of the denim jacket. Harmon looked at Maeve. He asked if she had a role here. She said yes. He asked what role. She said the animal was currently in her care, as the proprietor of a licensed therapeutic horse sanctuary, and that Eclipse was therefore under the authority of her operation for the purposes of rehabilitation and evaluation. Harmon looked at Grover. Grover looked at Maeve with an expression she could not entirely decode, something between irritation and a reluctant respect that he had not planned on developing. Harmon said the sanctuary would need to be registered as the current address of the animal with the board. He said the board would need documentation of the rehabilitation plan, evidence of the facility's licensing, and a formal statement regarding the circumstances of the horse's presence. He paused. He said the board also intended to conduct an on-site behavioral evaluation today, given that the animal was present and accessible. Maeve said that was fine. Eclipse was in the paddock. Harmon and one of the other councilmen walked to the fence line with a clipboard and began their evaluation, watching the horse's movement, noting his responses, making marks on the form. The horse watched them back. He was doing the thing he did when strangers came close. The low head, the elevated anxiety, the white showing at the edge of the eye. Controlled, but unmistakably present. Then Ivy, who had been standing with her father, started to cry. It wasn't dramatic. She was 6 years old, and she was scared, and she had been holding it in for days, and it slipped out of her, quietly, the way it does with children who are trying hard to be older than they are. A sound almost like a bird, small and high and helpless. And Eclipse stopped. He turned his head from the councilman and looked at Ivy. He walked to the fence. Not quickly. There was nothing aggressive in it, but with the directness of purpose that horses show when they are following something instinctive rather than trained. He came to the fence, and he put his nose through the lowest rail, toward the child, and he stood there. Ivy, who had been half hidden behind her father, moved forward without quite deciding to. The way children move toward animals, drawn by something they can't name. She pressed her face against the rail and put her hand up, and Eclipse's breath moved across her palm. He did not flinch. He did not startle. He lowered his head and he lay it alongside the fence rail. His great neck curved, and he was still. The councilmen had stopped writing. Grover was watching. Wayland's hand had found the back of his daughter's head without him looking. A reach made by instinct. The reach of a parent who needs to touch their child to confirm they are safe, even when safety is obvious. Maeve watched all of it, and she thought. She did not say it. She did not even let it fully form. That this animal was not violent. He had never been violent. He had been terrified and in pain and alone, and he had learned to perform ferocity because ferocity was the only language that had kept him at a safe distance from the things that hurt him. Except with this family. With this family, he had learned something else. The councilmen left without taking the horse. This was not a victory. Harmon made sure they understood that before he got in his SUV. He said the board would require a decision within 30 days. He said the sanctuary registration would need to be verified and current. He said the inquiry into the animal's removal from the Aldous estate was a separate matter that would proceed regardless of the horse's current placement. He said Wayland would need to appear before the board to give his account. The SUV doors closed. The animal control truck followed. Grover stood in the yard for a moment, looking at his barn, then at Maeve, then at nothing in particular, and then he drove away too. Maeve and Wayland and the children were left in a silence that felt, for the first time in several days, like something other than a countdown. But Maeve was already thinking about what Harmon had said, about the appearance before the board, about the statement, about the inquiry into the circumstances of the removal. She drove back to her ranch. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time with a cup of tea going cold in front of her. She had called her lawyer, a man named Perkins who had handled the property paperwork when the sanctuary was originally licensed and who had helped her sort out Daniel's estate, from the car on the way home. Perkins had listened. He had said a few things slowly, which was how he communicated weight. He said the key issue was the statement. If Wayland appeared before the board and gave his account, the board would want to know why he had taken the horse, who had authorized the transport decision, and what his relationship to the accident was. If Wayland told the truth, the full truth, including Grant Aldis's role in the decision to transport Eclipse early, the board's inquiry into the accident would take a different shape. Grant Aldis's estate, already in probate, would face questions. The children of a man who had spent 20 years building a reputation would have that reputation complicated in ways that would follow them. If Wayland stayed with the version he had been maintaining, that he had mishandled the situation, that the accident was substantially his fault, the board's inquiry would find what it was looking for. Wayland would bear the consequence. The cost of that consequence, Perkins said, was not small. It was possible that the custody arrangement for Wayland's children, already fragile, given his current living situation, could be affected. It was possible the board would revoke his training credentials. It was possible, depending on how the estate's representatives wanted to pursue it, that there were civil liability implications. Maeve sat with all of this. She thought about Grant Aldis, who had been good in the ways that mattered and had made one bad decision under financial pressure and had died knowing it. She thought about what it meant to protect a dead man's legacy. She thought about her own husband, Daniel, who had not been perfect, who had had his own bad decisions, his own moments of wrong-headed certainty, his own scars, and about how she would feel if someone sacrificed themselves to keep his memory clean. She thought about Wayland, about the way he had sat in that diner and given his children the only food he could afford without a word of complaint or self-pity, about the way he had driven 60 miles in the night with a traumatized horse and 2 sleeping children and ended up in someone else's abandoned barn, trying to build something from what was left. She thought about what it cost a person to hold a weight like that silently. She drove back to the barn the next morning. She told Wayland what Perkins had said, not as a recommendation, not as pressure. She laid it out the way you lay a map on a table. Here is the terrain. Here are the routes. Here are the things I can see that you might not be able to from where you're standing. Wayland listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. He was looking at Eclipse, who was at the far end of the paddock, grazing on the thin winter grass along the fence line. Then he said he had made a promise. She asked to whom. He said to a dying man in a hospital room who had looked at him with something he had not been looked at with since his own father. Something like trust, like the belief that this particular person would do the right thing. She said that was real. She said it mattered. Then she said something else. She said that Grant Aldis had also made a decision in that hospital room. He had asked Wayland to carry something for him. And that maybe the question wasn't whether to honor that. Maybe the question was whether a dying man had the right to ask a living one to pay the price for his mistakes indefinitely. Wayland's jaw tightened. She said she wasn't telling him what to do. She said she had a ranch that needed a trainer and a horse that needed rehabilitation and 2 children who needed a kitchen and a school bus route, and that none of those things required him to destroy his life to preserve a reputation. She said Grant Aldis had been a good man, and good men, in her experience, did not actually want to be protected at that cost. Wayland looked at her. He didn't say yes. He didn't say anything. But that night, when she drove past the barn on her way home, there was a light on in the small side room, and through the window, she could see him sitting at a table with a piece of paper in front of him and a pen in his hand. She kept driving. The hearing before the Wyoming Livestock Board was scheduled for 11 days later, in a county office in a town 40 minutes north. It was not a courtroom. It was a conference room with fluorescent lights and a folding table that had seen 20 years of hard agricultural decisions. But it carried the weight of those decisions in its particle board surface and its institutional green walls. Maeve drove Wayland there. She had told him she would, and she had told him it was not charity. He was going to be testifying on behalf of an animal that was currently registered to her sanctuary, which made her a party to the hearing regardless. Wayland had not argued, which, she had learned, was his way of accepting things he needed but couldn't say he needed. The children were with Daria, who had volunteered without being asked after overhearing enough of the situation at the diner to understand the broad outlines. Grover, to his credit, had not discouraged this. In the car on the way up, Wayland sat with a manila envelope on his lap and looked at the road. The envelope contained the statement. He had shown it to Perkins the day before. Perkins had said it was thorough and honest, and that it would likely shift the board's inquiry significantly. He had also said it was Wayland's decision entirely. Wayland had not spoken about what was in it. Maeve had not asked. But about 20 minutes into the drive, In that flat particular landscape where Wyoming showed its most unadorned face, the big sky, the sage flats, the fence line disappearing into the distance, he said something. He said he had written two versions. She looked at the road. He said the first one was the one he'd been telling for months. His fault, his error, his responsibility. He said the second one was what had actually happened. She kept her hands on the wheel. He said he had lain awake for 3 nights trying to decide which one to bring. He said he kept thinking about Grant, about a morning 6 years ago when he had shown up at the ranch in a bad state, after the divorce, after several months of barely holding it together, and Grant had given him the worst job on the property, the most physically demanding one, and had worked alongside him in silence all morning without asking a single question, and how that had been the first day in a long time that he had felt like a person with a function. Maeve said nothing. He said he owed that man something. She said yes. Then she said that what he owed that man was the truth that Grant had been trying to reach toward himself in those last 6 weeks before he died. The acknowledgement that he had made a mistake and that a good horse and a good trainer had paid for it. She said keeping that truth buried didn't honor Grant. It just kept everyone in the dark. She said she had been in the dark for 18 months. After Daniel had stopped the sanctuary, stopped working, stopped most things. And she had told herself it was grief. And it was grief. But it was also the particular cowardice of someone who found it easier to let things die than to fight for them in pain. She said she wasn't finished with cowardice. But she was working on it. Wayland looked at her. She looked at the road. He opened the envelope. He took out 2 folded pages. He looked at them for a moment, the false one, the true one, and then he put one of them back in the envelope and folded it in half. He held the other one in his hand for the rest of the drive. The hearing lasted 90 minutes. Maeve waited in the hallway. She could hear very little through the door, low voices, occasional longer stretches of quiet, the particular sound of a room in which something is being understood. When Wayland came out, he looked like a man who had put something down after carrying it for a long time. Not lighter exactly, it doesn't work like that, but different. The set of his shoulders was not the same as when he had gone in. He sat down next to her in the hallway chair. She asked how it had gone. He said they had a lot of questions. She asked if he had answered them. He said he had answered all of them. She nodded. They sat for a moment in the humming quiet of the county office hallway. Then she stood up, and he stood up, and they walked out into the October cold to drive back to where the children were waiting, and a horse named Eclipse was standing in a paddock that was no longer quite temporary enough. The board's response was not immediate. In the week that followed the hearing, 3 things happened in a sequence that felt, to Maeve, like watching a structure shift in slow motion. The kind of movement that looks small but represents forces that have been building for a long time. The first was that Harmon called Perkins, not Wayland, Perkins, which meant the board was no longer treating Wayland as the central problem. They had new information now. The inquiry had been reopened along different lines. Harmon had not been warm about it, but he had acknowledged that the board would need to review the accident documentation with the information Wayland had provided. He said there would be a period of reassessment. The second was that 2 members of the estate, Grant Aldis's son and daughter, drove out from Casper, not to the county office, to the barn. They came on a Wednesday afternoon without calling ahead. Maeve was there. She watched them get out of their car and look at Eclipse in the paddock with expressions that were complicated in ways that neither of them had fully expected. They had been told the horse was dangerous. They had been told Wayland had mishandled the situation. They had come, Maeve suspected, to confirm what they believed and leave. Instead, they stood at the fence and watched a man work quietly in a paddock with a horse that stood still while he moved around it. And they watched that horse pick his head up and watch the man the way animals watch things they have decided to trust. Grant Aldis's daughter, a woman in her late 30s with her father's eyes, said nothing for a long time. Then she said that her father had talked about this horse. Said he'd talked about it more in the last year than anything else on the property. Said he'd told her, 2 days before he died, that he'd made a mistake with it. She looked at Wayland. She didn't apologize. Neither did he. But something passed between them in the silence that functioned as an acknowledgement of the man they had both known, of the cost his decision had carried, of the complexity of holding both his goodness and his mistake at the same time. The third thing that happened was the one that had the most immediate practical weight. Grover came to see Maeve at her ranch. He pulled into her driveway late on a Thursday afternoon and sat in his truck for a moment before getting out, which she had learned was his version of rehearsing something. She met him at the porch. He said he had been thinking. He said the barn situation was going to need to resolve one way or another. He said he had no particular desire to be the person who made things harder, and that he had not fully understood what the situation involved when he had called the livestock board. He said he hadn't called them maliciously. He had called them because he genuinely didn't know what to do with an unregistered horse on his property and a tenant who wasn't paying, and the board had seemed like the correct channel. He said he was sorry it had made things harder. Maeve looked at him. He said that if the man and the children needed the barn for another month while things resolved, he would not charge rent for it. She said she appreciated that. He said he'd heard she was reopening the sanctuary. She said she was considering it. He said Daniel had built something good out there. He said he'd heard that from people over the years and hadn't said it to her because he hadn't thought it was his place. He said it was his place now. She looked out at the property, at the fence line that needed repair, the barn roof that sagged, the pastures that had grown back in grass over everything Daniel had planted. She said she would let Waylon know about the barn. Grover nodded. He got back in his truck. He drove away. She found the fence sections on a Saturday morning. She had known something was different when she came out at 6 for her first walk of the property, a habit she had started 2 weeks earlier, a thing she told herself was practical, was about assessing what needed doing, was not about the particular feeling of being on the land in the early morning when the frost turned the grass silver and the horses on neighboring properties moved in the distance like slow thoughts. The east fence line had been a mess for months. 3 sections with posts healed over by the spring ground thaw, the wires sagging between them in a way that would have meant, if she were still running horses, a liability she couldn't accept. She had put it on her list. She had not gotten to it. She came around the barn on the east side and stopped. For posts, set clean. New wire, strung tight. The work was professional, not just repaired but done properly, with the post caps she had in the storage shed and the correct tension on the wire. There was no note. There was no indication of when it had been done. But the knees of the mud by the post holes were still dark, which meant it had been last night. She looked at the work for a long time. She walked the rest of the east fence. All of it, 30 yards of line, had been redone. She walked to the south side and found 2 more sections. She walked to the north side and found another one. 6 fence sections. One night, alone, working by headlamp presumably, in October cold, she stood in the north pasture for a while, looking at the work, with the particular feeling of someone who has been caught in an act of receiving without meaning to. She drove to the barn. Wayland was with the horse. Eclipse was in the small paddock, and Wayland was doing a groundwork exercise with him. The kind of slow, patient work that looks like nothing until you understand that it is the accumulated grammar of a new language being built between 2 creatures who are learning how to talk to each other. He looked exhausted, the kind of exhausted that a person tries to move past rather than through. She stood at the fence. She said she had seen the work. He kept his attention on the horse. She said she hadn't asked him to do it. He said he knew. She said she didn't need it done that way, in secret, at night, at his own cost. He stopped. He let the rope go slack. He looked at her. He said he wasn't going to live on somebody's land and eat somebody's food and have his children sleep in somebody's barn and not put something back. He said he had nothing else to offer. She said that was not true. He looked at her. She said she had a horse in a paddock that was too small and a round pen that needed cleaning and 8 months of rehabilitation work ahead of her and nobody who knew how to do it. She said she had a sanctuary license and no animals and no program and no direction. She said she needed someone who knew what they were doing. He was quiet. She said she was not offering charity. She said she was offering a job, a real one, with a salary she could currently afford and a house. The small foreman's house at the back of the property, which had been sitting empty for 2 years, that came with it. She said the job would last as long as the work lasted, and the work would last as long as they both decided to do it. He looked at the horse. Eclipse was standing at the edge of the paddock, watching them both. He said he wasn't good at accepting things. She said she'd noticed. He said he'd think about it. She said she knew. She had given him 3 days to think. On the 2nd day, Leo got sick. It was nothing severe, a child's fever, the kind that spikes hard at night and then breaks toward morning. But it happened in the barn, in the back of the truck, and by the time Waylon got to Maeve's door at 2 in the morning with the boy wrapped in a moving blanket and a temperature of 103, it was clear that the calculation of pride and independence he had been running in his head had hit a wall. She did not make it significant. She took Leo inside. She found the children's ibuprofen in the bathroom cabinet. She made up the guest room that had been her office for the last 18 months. and she put the boy in it without a word about what this meant. Waylon sat in the kitchen while she did this. She could hear him from the hallway. The particular quality of a person's presence in an unfamiliar space when they are ashamed of needing to be there. When she came back to the kitchen, she put the kettle on. He said he'd had the job offer from a ranch in Nevada. It had come through 2 weeks ago. A training position, decent money, no history with the livestock board. He said it would have solved the immediate problems. She waited. He said Eclipse couldn't go to Nevada. The ranch wouldn't take an animal with the board's inquiry attached to it. She said she understood. He said he'd turned the Nevada job down. She looked at him. He said he'd turned it down before she had offered him the position here. Before any of this. He had turned it down because he was not going to put that horse in another unfamiliar situation for the 3rd time in 8 months. And because his children had already moved twice in a year. And because sometimes a person makes a decision based on what is right rather than what is easy and lives with the consequences. He said this without self-pity, as a statement of record. She poured the tea. She set a cup in front of him. He wrapped his hands around it and looked at the steam. She said she was going to need an answer about the job. He said yes. She said, was that a yes to the question or a yes, as in that was his answer? He said both. They sat in the kitchen at 2:30 in the morning with the tea and the sound of a child sleeping in the next room and a horse in a paddock down the road that had stopped circling and started waiting, which was entirely different. There was one more thing. The following morning, Perkins called. The board had completed its preliminary review of the new information. The inquiry into the removal of the animal had been formally reclassified. Wayland was no longer listed as the primary responsible party for the accident. The estate's representatives, following the conversation with Grant Aldis's daughter, had withdrawn their request for the animal's euthanasia. The path to formal registration of Eclipse with the sanctuary was clear. It was not a clean resolution. The board would continue reviewing the accident documentation. There were things that would remain complicated. Wayland's name had been attached to a difficult episode, and the attachment didn't simply dissolve because the record had been corrected. But the horse was safe, and that had been the thing from the beginning. The thing everything else had organized itself around. The horse, and the family, and the question of what kind of place a person could build for the things that needed protecting. The winter passed, and then the spring. The foreman's house got a new window in the kitchen that Wayland installed himself on a Saturday, with Leo handing him tools and Ivy supervising from the porch with the seriousness of a child who has decided construction is interesting. The heating unit had needed parts, which Maeve had ordered, and Wayland had spent an afternoon in the crawl space making the repairs, which was not in any job description but which he had done without comment. The fences along the east and south lines were now the strongest on the property. This was a fact, not a metaphor, though it functioned as both. Eclipse came out of his rehabilitation in stages that did not announce themselves. There was no day on which he became a different horse. Instead, there was a slow accumulation of small moments. A day he walked toward Maeve rather than away from her. A morning he let her touch his neck without flinching. An afternoon he stood in the center of the round pen and breathed slowly while Wayland moved around him and the children played on the fence rails, and the October light came in through the barn door and made everything warm. He was not the horse he would have been without the accident. That horse no longer existed. The horse that existed was the one that had lived through the accident and through the subsequent months of uncertainty and had arrived on the other side of them. Not unchanged, not unmarked, but present, functioning, something like whole. 3 new horses arrived at the sanctuary in the spring. 2 came from a county rescue program. Animals in poor condition, underweight and under-socialized. The kind of cases that used to come to Maeve and Daniel during the early years. The 3rd was a young mare donated by a breeder in Sheridan who had heard, through the particular network by which rural news travels, that the Colton Sanctuary was operational again. Maeve stood at the round pen on a May morning and watched Wayland work with the mare. She had her coffee. The air smelled like wet grass and horse, and the particular clean scent of Wyoming in spring that had always struck her as the smell of things being possible again. Leo came running from the direction of the house, still in his pajama top, shoes on wrong feet, to tell her the water was boiling for breakfast. She told him she'd be right in. He ran back. She watched him go. Then she looked back at the pen. She had made a call the previous week, the first call she had made in this direction in 2 years, to the Veterans Outreach Coordinator she used to work with when the sanctuary ran its therapeutic program. She had told him it was early, that they were not ready to take participants. that there was still work to do on the facilities and on two of the horses, but that she wanted to put a marker down, that she wanted him to know the program was coming back. He had said he'd been waiting for that call. She had stood in the kitchen holding the phone for a moment after hanging up, looking at the window above the sink. Not crying, not quite smiling, just standing with the particular feeling of a person who has found their way back to something they had decided was gone. The truth, which she had been moving toward without quite letting herself name it, was that she had stopped the sanctuary not because she had lost the capability to do the work, but because she had been afraid that doing it without Daniel would confirm something she did not want confirmed, that the healing was his, that the gift had lived in him and not in her, that she had been a partner but not the source. What the winter had shown her was that this was wrong. She had walked into a diner and seen a man who needed food, and she had known what to do. She had walked into a yard with a traumatized horse, and she had known what she was looking at. She had stood in a county office hallway and waited for a man to give his testimony, and she had known that it was right to be there. These things did not come from Daniel. They came from the years they had worked together, which had built something in her that was hers now, permanently hers, not borrowed, not contingent on his presence. She finished her coffee. The morning opened up around her. The pastures, the barn, the new fence line, the round pen where Wayland was finishing his session with the mare, and Eclipse, standing in his paddock by the east fence, his head up, watching the activity of the yard with the calm attention of an animal that has made its peace with a particular piece of ground. He was still not easy. He probably would not be easy for some time. There were mornings when the old pattern resurfaced, and he retreated to the far corner and wanted nothing to do with anything human. There were days when a sound or a smell set off something old and deep, and he needed an hour of quiet before he could be approached again. But he was there. He had chosen to be there, in the way that horses choose, not through words or logic, but through the daily decision to stand in a particular place and let that place be home. Ivy came out of the house wearing her boots and Maeve's old canvas jacket, which went to her knees, carrying a bucket toward the water trough at the north end of the pasture. She was doing her morning job, the one she had given herself after watching the adults do it for a week and deciding she was ready. She was 6 years old and entirely serious about it. Maeve watched her cross the yard. There was one moment, near the end of the season, that she had not told anyone about. It had happened at dusk, 3 weeks after Eclipse had been formally registered with the sanctuary, when she had been alone in the barn and had walked to his stall for no particular reason. Not to work with him, not to evaluate him, just to be near him. He had been standing quietly, shifting his weight slightly, and she had put her hand on the door of the stall, and he had turned and looked at her. Not with the old wariness, just looked, and then he had come forward and rested his nose against her shoulder. She had stood very still. The barn had been quiet. Outside, the early dark of Wyoming fall was coming in. Somewhere across the property, a fence gate had knocked in the wind. The horse breathed against her shoulder, long and even. She had stood there for a long time, not saying anything, not doing anything, just standing in the dark with an animal that had decided she was safe, and letting that, for the first time in 18 months, be enough. If this story stayed with you, if you found yourself thinking about Maeve, about Wayland, about a horse that learned to trust again, and about what it costs a person to start over when they thought they were done, that is exactly what these stories are made for. Leave a comment and tell us which part hit you hardest. Was it the diner? The barn at 2 in the morning? The moment in the round pen? And tell us where you are watching from. Every city, every country, every person who stops to watch a story like this is why these stories get made. If you believe a story like this belongs in the world, give it a like. If you want more like it, stories about quiet courage, second chances, and the animals and people that carry us back to who we are, subscribe. The next story is already coming. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being the kind of person who watches things like this all the way to the end.